So we're engaged in yet another conflict in the Middle East, and predictions of doom and gloom are almost everywhere. I want to walk you through why I don't think this is the apocalypse, and I'll close with some thoughts on what I see as the bigger picture. Middle East conflicts tend to conjure images of holy wars, gas lines, and stagflation, and people naturally associate those conflicts with the Yom Kippur War and the oil embargo of 1973. Fair enough. So the concern right now is that Iran will succeed in closing the Strait of Hormuz, cutting off 20% of the world's oil supply, triggering record high prices at the pump, and an international financial catastrophe. And from there, the extrapolation goes something like this. Russia benefits from high oil prices, their economy recovers, the war in Ukraine escalates, and suddenly we're talking about World War III. That's a worst case scenario. Let's give it a reality check. First, it's not 1973, and the world is no longer as vulnerable to oil price shocks. Most people tend to forget that the United States became a net energy exporter in 2019, which means we produce more oil than we consume. We still import oil, but that's a topic for another video. What matters for today is that we have multiple mechanisms in place to protect the global supply of oil. That doesn't prevent markets from overreacting or investors from feeling the stress of that overreaction, but it does change the underlying risk profile significantly. So let's walk through a true worst-case scenario, one in which Iran actually succeeds to some degree in closing the Strait of Hormuz. It's worth acknowledging that concern over oil prices isn't irrational. Oil is a commodity known to have inelastic demand, which means that as the supply for oil drops, the amount of oil demanded doesn't significantly change. So if we suddenly lose 20% of the world's oil supply, and the world doesn't reduce its demand by 20%, that's exactly the kind of scenario that drives sharp price increases. It's a legitimate risk. But as I mentioned, the world has built protections against exactly this kind of event. Unfortunately, much of the media business model is, at its core, a well-honed rumor mill built to foster fear. So there's little incentive for rational discourse. Worst-case scenarios drive ad revenue, and even stock trading algorithms often amplify market volatility during periods of stress. Yes, computers have figured out a way to profit from human anxiety. When you combine those two forces, you get markets behaving as though civilization is ending when the underlying fundamentals are inconveniently fine. Let's talk about the actual protections in place. First, there are pipeline alternatives that allow Middle East exporters to bypass the Persian Gulf entirely. The Saudi East-West pipeline has an estimated capacity of about 4 million barrels per day. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline adds another 500,000 barrels per day, and together they can replace roughly 25% of what currently moves through the Strait of Hormuz. Second, there's the International Energy Agency. The IEA was created in 1974 by people who actually lived through the oil embargo of 1973, and they decided, they didn't want to let that happen again. Member nations that are net oil importers, which account for about 30 of the 32 members, are required to maintain at least 90 days worth of oil imports in reserve. Together they hold approximately 1.2 billion barrels, plus there's an additional 600 million barrels required by individual governments. But here's where the math gets interesting. That 90-day reserve is calculated based on total net oil imports, not just imports from the Middle East. So, for example, if 20% of a nation's oil imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz, then congratulations, that 90-day reserve will actually last 450 days. There's also a mandatory demand reduction plan every member nation has to keep at the ready. So they really thought this through. Third, there's simple economics. Rising oil prices make previously unprofitable oil fields and fracking operations suddenly viable. As prices climb through various thresholds, more production comes online, effectively creating a natural ceiling on prices. That equilibrium doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen. Let's talk about Iran's actual ability to close the strait. The narrowest point of the strait is roughly 24 miles across. To be effective, Iran would need to lay naval mines across its entire width, and it would have to do so under the watchful eyes of 2 U.S. aircraft carrier strike groups, with a third on the way. If news reports are correct, then the first week of the war didn't go well for the Iranian Navy, because most, if not all, of their ships are now resting at the bottom of the ocean. Now, that doesn't eliminate every option available to them, but it dramatically limits their capacity. And as the US continues hitting Iranian missile capabilities, that capacity will only continue to diminish. So I think safe passage through the strait has become more a question of when, not if. Roughly 500 ships are currently parked just outside the strait, and we're already seeing some movement through the strait. As the risk of passage decreases, and as insurance coverage and rates normalize, shipping will resume. There's simply too much global economic pressure for Iran to sustain a blockade. So let's play out a scenario in which Iran succeeds in disrupting half of all traffic through the strait, which is probably significantly overestimating their capability. If the Saudi and Abu Dhabi pipelines are able to absorb 25% of traffic, the net loss is roughly 25% of Persian Gulf oil exports. And that's a serious disruption, but it's a manageable one, particularly given the IEA reserve and demand reduction mechanisms already in place. It also assumes Iran could sustain a strategy that essentially eliminates its own oil export revenue, and I don't think they can maintain that strategy very long. For the United States specifically, about 8% of our oil imports pass through the strait. 8%. In the virtual impossible scenario of a complete blockade, our 90-day reserve is designed to protect 100% of our total import needs, and that far exceeds the 8% we'd lose from the Persian Gulf. The math works out to over 3 years of oil we reserve just for emergency purposes. 3 years. So no, I'm not in the camp predicting financial catastrophe. The mechanisms protecting the global oil supply are real, they are substantial, and they are specifically designed for this kind of scenario. Now, I want to close with what I think may be the bigger strategic picture, because I think it could play a significant role in our longer-term future. And I want to be clear, this is just my interpretation. I see the operation in Iran as having a multi-tiered purpose. Yes, it was designed to address Iran's ever-present nuclear threat and their long-standing role in exporting terrorism. But I think the broader audience may have been Beijing. It's pretty hard to ignore the pattern. Panama, Venezuela, Iran, all significant Chinese allies, targeted in rapid succession. Capturing Maduro effectively ended Venezuela's partnership with China, costing Beijing a major oil supplier. And that same outcome is likely for Iran, which was directing 70 to 80% of its oil exports to China, much of it at discounted prices. China is the world's largest oil importer, and that dependence is a profound strategic vulnerability. So when Chairman Xi watched U.S. aircraft penetrate Iranian airspace, where Iran's entire layered defense network, Russian systems, Chinese origin components, and Iran's domestically built surface-to-air defense system was rendered completely ineffective, that had to register. Not one American plane was hit. I could be wrong about the ultimate intent, but the pattern is hard to dismiss. Here's the takeaway for investors. Geopolitical shocks often cause short-term market reactions, but markets historically adjust faster than headlines suggest, which is why maintaining a disciplined long-term strategy remains the most reliable approach during periods of instability. Let me know what you think, and feel free to call me if you have any questions.